The Norse called it Yggdrasil, a tree so enormous that its branches held 9 worlds. Its roots ran down through the earth into the realm of the dead. Its canopy stretched past the clouds and into the domain of the gods. It was the axis of the universe, the spine around which all of creation organized itself. The ancient Hindus called it the Ashvatha, the cosmic tree. Its roots grew upward, and its branches descended downward, which sounds like the description of something so large it inverted the observer's sense of orientation. The Bhagavad Gita says this tree is eternal, and the one who knows it knows everything. The Maya built their entire cosmology around the Yaksha, the sacred tree. Its roots were in the underworld, its trunk in the middle world, its crown above the sky. Every Maya temple was built as a representation of this tree. Every ritual centered on its memory. The calendar they developed, the most precise in the ancient world, was connected to cycles they associated with this tree. The ancient Chinese recorded the Jianmu, a tree that grew at the center of the world and served as a ladder between heaven and earth. The emperors climbed it, the gods descended it. It stood at the pivot of the cosmos, and everything that existed radiated outward from its trunk. The Mesopotamians had the Hulupu tree, planted by the goddess Inanna at the banks of the Euphrates before the Great Displacement. The Sumerians recorded trees that connected earth to heaven in their earliest surviving tablets, predating every other written literature by centuries. The Aboriginal Australians, who have lived on their continent for longer than any other continuous culture on Earth, may carry memories of trees that reached into the sky world, trees that were pathways to other realms, trees that the first ancestors climbed to reach the stars. The Siberian shamanic traditions, from dozens of distinct cultures spread across millions of square kilometers, universally describe a world tree at the center of the cosmos. The shaman's drum is made from its wood. The shaman's journey upward is a climb through its branches. Every Siberian people who had never contacted each other independently preserved the identical image. The Egyptians had the Isht tree growing at Heliopolis, the site of creation. Its fruit gave life. The gods wrote the names of the pharaohs on its leaves to ensure eternal life. It stood at the place where the sun first rose over the world. The Iranians had the Gaukarina tree in the middle of the cosmic sea, a source of all plants, all medicine, all healing. The Zoroastrian texts describe it in detail that goes far beyond metaphor. It is a specific organism with specific properties, operating in a specific location. The Japanese had the sacred Sakaki tree connecting the human world to the world of the kami. The Finnish had their world tree at the center of everything. The Baltic peoples had their cosmic tree. The Slavic peoples had their world tree. The Native American nations across North, Central, and South America independently preserved dozens of variants of the same image. A tree at the center, a tree that reached the sky, a tree that organized reality. Now stop, take a breath, and think about what it means that cultures separated by oceans, mountain ranges, deserts, thousands of years, and thousands of kilometers preserved the same memory. The conventional academic answer is that this represents a universal archetype, a psychological symbol that arises spontaneously in all human minds, because trees are meaningful to humans everywhere. The tree as symbol, they say, is an expression of the human psyche projecting growth and connection onto its environment. But that explanation would be more convincing if the myths were vague, if they only said a very big tree or an important tree, but they do not say that. They are specific. They describe scale. They describe function. They describe location. They describe what happened to this tree. And across cultures that had no contact with each other, the specifics align in ways that a psychological archetype cannot explain. You do not get independent cultures describing a tree that specifically reaches through the clouds to a sky realm, that specifically has roots in an underworld, that specifically stands at the center of the earth, and that specifically connects the 3 vertical levels of existence, unless they are all remembering the same thing, unless there was something real that all of them, or their ancestors, actually saw. The Tartaria hypothesis does not begin with mythology. It begins with physical evidence, but the mythology is the confirmation layer. It is the independent verification system that runs parallel to the geological and biological record and arrives at the same conclusion through a completely different path. But the truth is, when the stones and the stories agree, you are not dealing with coincidence. So what was this tree? Not what mythology says about it symbolically. What was it physically? What kind of organism was it? What were its dimensions? How did it function? And why is nothing like it alive anywhere on Earth today? The researchers who have worked most seriously on this question are not botanists in the mainstream tradition. They are people who started by looking at anomalies in the geological record and followed the evidence to a conclusion that the establishment cannot accommodate without dismantling itself entirely. The Russian researcher known in these communities as Lyudmila Chanayeva produced work examining the biological characteristics of what the fossil record actually contains when you remove the assumption of deep geological time. What she found is that the organisms in the petrified and silicified record are not ancient, they are recent, and they were not small. The silicification process, the conversion of organic material into mineral structure, does not require millions of years. It requires the right chemical environment. Silica-saturated water flowing through organic material can mineralize wood in decades. The assumption that petrified wood equals ancient wood is not based on chemistry. It is based on the theoretical framework that was built to explain the fossil record in a particular way. When you remove that assumption and look at the actual chemistry, the timeline collapses. The petrified forests could be hundreds of years old, not millions. And if they are hundreds of years old, then what produced them was alive recently, which means the organisms that became those formations were part of the world that existed just before the historical record we have been given begins. Just before the reset, just before the window of 1780 to 1830, when the current institutional framework was constructed and the definitions were installed that tell us what is a tree and what is a geological formation. Go to Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona. Stand next to one of the large fossilized logs that the Park Service displays. They will tell you this log is 225 million years old. They will tell you it was once a tree that fell in an ancient forest and was slowly replaced by minerals over geological time. Now look at the log. Look at its surface texture. Look at its cross-section. This is not a log that fell and was buried. The cellular structure visible in the cross-sections of these specimens is still organized, still showing the growth ring patterns, the vascular channels, the biological architecture of a living organism. 225 million years of geological processes do not leave you with readable cellular structure. That level of preservation at that claimed age contradicts what we know about how organic material behaves over time. But if the mineralization happened fast in chemically saturated water following a catastrophic event in the last few centuries, the preservation of cellular structure makes complete sense. You are not looking at an ancient organism. You are looking at a recent one that experienced rapid mineralization under post-catastrophe conditions. Now look at the scale. These logs at Petrified Forest National Park run up to 3 meters in diameter for the sections that are visible. The Park Service notes that the trees they represent were large by any standard. But the sections visible are only the trunk segments that remained after the catastrophe. The full height of what these organisms were is not preserved in the park. What is preserved is a sample of the structural remnant, only a fraction of the whole. To understand the whole, you have to look at what mythology describes and ask whether the physics are possible. A tree hundreds of meters tall, is that within the range of biological possibility given the right atmospheric and gravitational conditions? The tallest living tree today is just over 115 meters. The upper limit is set by the physics of water transport from roots to canopy. At greater heights, the tree cannot pull water high enough to sustain the upper structure. But that limit applies under current atmospheric conditions, current atmospheric pressure, and current gravitational conditions. If any of those variables were different in the past, the height limit changes. Some researchers in the Tartaria community have proposed that the Earth's gravitational field has changed, that it was weaker in the pre-reset world, allowing for larger organisms, both plant and animal. But the truth is, this is the kind of idea that would explain both the megaflora and the megafauna that appear in the fossil record in ways biologists struggle to account for under current gravitational conditions. This is speculative in the strictest sense, but it is not irrational speculation. It follows from the physical evidence and asks what conditions could have produced it. Others focus on atmospheric density. If the pre-reset atmosphere was denser, more particle-rich, as the painting evidence suggests it was, then the physics of water transport in tall organisms changes. A denser atmosphere exerts more pressure at ground level, which affects the fluid dynamics inside plant vascular systems. Under higher atmospheric pressure, trees could potentially sustain height far beyond the current theoretical limit. You do not need to commit to either theory to see what the evidence demands. Something produced organisms of enormous scale. Something produced organisms large enough that every culture on Earth encoded the memory of them in its foundational mythology. Something produced organisms large enough that their fossilized remains now sit in national parks and are misidentified as the products of geological processes spanning hundreds of millions of years. Now go back to the mythology. Look more carefully at what it actually says about the fate of these trees. In Norse tradition, Yggdrasil is not eternal. It is under constant threat. The serpent, Nidhogg, gnaws at its roots eternally. The goats of Asgard eat its leaves. The stag, Ecthernir, grazes on its branches. The tree is always being consumed, always being reduced. And the prophecy of Ragnarok, the end of the current age, begins with Yggdrasil shaking, trembling. The world tree is the first casualty of the end of the world as the Norse understood it. In Hindu tradition, the Ashvatha is described in ways that suggest both its cosmic importance and its eventual destruction. The Bhagavad Gita says it must be cut down. Krishna tells Arjuna to cut the deeply rooted Ashvatha tree with the strong sword of detachment. This is read as metaphor for releasing attachment to the material world, but the instruction is specific. Cut the tree with a specific instrument at a specific moment for a specific purpose. The Maya described the fall of their world tree in the Popol Vuh as part of the transition from one world age to the next. The great tree fell, and a new world was organized around its absence. The temples that replaced it were built as symbolic substitutes for the tree itself. Triangular structures rising toward the sky in imitation of the canopy they could no longer reach. The Siberian traditions almost universally describe the world tree as no longer fully accessible. The shamans who once climbed it physically now climb it only in trance states. The tree is present in the spirit world, but no longer in the physical world in the way it once was. The memory of physical access to it has faded into the mythology of a prior age. The Mesopotamian texts, the Sumerian and Akkadian records, describe the great trees being taken, stolen, removed by forces that later interpreters read as mythology, but which read equally well as historical record. Gilgamesh himself goes to the cedar forest, the forest guarded by the monster Humbaba, and cuts down the greatest trees. This story is read as a heroic quest, but read it as history. A king deliberately removed the greatest trees from a protected forest against the will of the divine guardian of that forest. And the consequence of that removal echoes through the rest of the Mesopotamian tradition as the beginning of a decline that ends in catastrophe. Every tradition says the same thing in its own way. They were enormous trees. They were the center of everything. They were cut, eaten, destroyed, removed, felled, and when they were gone, the age ended. That is not archetype. That is collective historical memory. These cultures are remembering an event, not dreaming a symbol. The physical confirmation of that event is not hidden. It is sitting in open view, labeled as something else, in parks and on geological survey maps, and in the field notes of 19th century naturalists who could not understand what they were looking at because the institutional framework that would have allowed them to understand it was being constructed at the same moment to prevent exactly that understanding. Look at the distribution of what geologists call table mountains, flat-topped elevations that rise sharply from surrounding terrain and terminate in a horizontal platform. They exist on every continent. The conventional explanation is erosion. The surrounding terrain eroded away, leaving the harder rock of the table mountain standing. But this explanation struggles with the geometry. The tops of these formations are not random. They are flat, not roughly flat, precisely flat. Erosion does not produce precision. Erosion produces irregular, jagged surfaces. The flat tops of table mountains are not the product of differential erosion. They are the product of something that was flat to begin with. What is flat to begin with at the top of a tall structure? The cross-section of a cut. A flat horizontal cut across a cylindrical structure produces a flat top. If the cylindrical structure then fossilized, what you would have is a flat-topped formation rising from the surrounding terrain. Precisely the geometry we see in table mountains globally. The Tepuy of Venezuela are a striking example. Flat-top mesas rising thousands of meters from the Amazon basin floor, topped with ecosystems found nowhere else on Earth because they have been isolated by altitude long enough that evolution diverged entirely. The official explanation says they are the remnants of an ancient plateau, the surrounding rock having eroded away over hundreds of millions of years. But the ecosystems on their tops include organisms that have no relationship to deep geological time in their evolutionary history. They are isolated, yes, but not ancient. They are isolated because the structures they sit on top of were cut from the rest of the landscape recently enough that the isolation produced speciation, but not the kind of divergence you would expect over hundreds of millions of years. Roraima in particular, the tepuy that inspired Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World, has a top surface that is simultaneously ancient in its rock composition and recent in its biological inhabitants. The official science acknowledges the paradox and does not resolve it. The Tartaria framework resolves it immediately. The rock is old because the organism that produced the structure drew minerals from deep geological layers over a long lifespan. But the structure itself, the stump, is recent. The top surface has been exposed for centuries, not millions of years, long enough for isolated evolution of its surface ecosystem, but not long enough to produce deep geological divergence. Devil's Tower in Wyoming deserves special attention because the geological establishment has worked harder to explain it than almost any other anomalous formation. The columns of phonolite porphyry that make up the tower are so geometrically precise, so consistently hexagonal, that the geological community produced multiple competing explanations over the decades before settling on a version of volcanic cooling theory. But volcanic cooling, even under ideal conditions, produces columns that are irregular, that vary in width, that taper, that intersect at non-uniform angles. Devil's Tower's columns are none of those things. They are remarkably consistent, remarkably uniform, remarkably regular, and that is the point. The geometry is not what volcanic cooling produces. The geometry is what biological structure produces. The geometry of the interior of a large cylindrical organism mineralized rapidly and then exposed by the erosion of the surrounding softer material. The indigenous peoples of the region where Devil's Tower stands have oral traditions about the formation that do not describe a volcanic event. They describe a living entity, a sacred site with a presence that is not geological. Several traditions describe it as a tree stump. The conventional academic response to this indigenous knowledge is to categorize it as mythology and defer to the geological explanation. But the indigenous knowledge predates the geological explanation by thousands of years. And really, this is what matters most. It matches the physical geometry better than the official theory does. Now, extend this pattern globally. Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland, the Organ Pipes of Victoria in Australia, the columnar basalt formations of Iceland, the hexagonal column formations found in dozens of locations across every continent. all of them given volcanic explanations, all of them exhibiting geometry more consistent with biological structure than with any volcanic process. But the truth is, all of them are also located in regions that old maps and old traditions mark as zones of unusual biological activity, dense forests, sacred groves, centers of the world according to indigenous traditions. The Sakha people of Siberia, one of the oldest continuous cultures in the world, have maintained for millennia that certain rock formations in their territory are the petrified remains of trees from a previous age. They call the territory where these formations cluster the place of the Old World. The geological survey done by Soviet scientists in the 20th century documented these formations and classified them as volcanic. The Sakha knowledge was filed under folklore, but the Sakha were there when the previous age ended, or their ancestors were. Their oral tradition is a continuous chain that runs back further than any written record. When they say those rocks are trees, they are not speaking metaphorically. They are transmitting a memory. Before you even reach the physical geology, there is a category of evidence that sits between the mythology and the stones. The maps, the cartographic record of the world from the 16th and 17th centuries, contains anomalies that mainstream historians handle with careful silence. Regions marked on these maps as forests are too large. The forest designations on pre-1800 European cartography cover territories at densities that do not correspond to any forest type we know of today. The Amazon is the densest biological zone on the current Earth, and it does not approach the canopy density that some of these map designations imply. So what were the cartographers encoding when they marked those territories? What did the word forest mean to a 16th century mapmaker that it does not mean to us? If what they were marking were ecosystems containing organisms of the scale the mythology describes, then the density designations make sense. If what they were marking were forests as we understand them today, the density designations are exaggerated beyond anything that grows on Earth. Old maps also contain something else that almost no one discusses. Regions that transition between one edition and the next, from forest designation to either blank space or settled territory in the exact time window of the reset. Territories that were heavily forest-marked on 1700s cartography appear as open land on 1850s cartography, not because the forests were logged in the conventional sense, but because whatever was there was no longer there. The transition is too rapid for conventional deforestation of any forest type. When you step back and look at the combined weight of this evidence, the mythological record, the cartographic anomalies, the geological formations, the biological evidence in the petrified and silicified fossil record, the atmospheric record visible in pre-1800 paintings, and the institutional record of how the new definitions were installed at the precise moment this evidence needed to be reclassified, a picture begins to emerge that is coherent in all of its parts. Before the reset, Earth had a different biological infrastructure, organisms of enormous scale, the megaflora that every culture on Earth remembers as the world tree, or the cosmic tree, or the axis of the universe, were a real part of the physical environment. They were not metaphors. They were not archetypes arising from the collective unconscious. They were organisms that people could see, touch, walk under, and climb. They were tall enough that their canopy genuinely reached into the cloud layer and in some cases above it. They were large enough that their trunks, now fossilized, are mistaken for geological features. These organisms performed functions that no current organism performs. They processed the atmosphere. They regulated particle distribution in the upper air. They connected the hydrological systems of the deep Earth to the atmospheric water cycle at heights that no current organism approaches. They were the central nervous system of a planetary ecology that no longer exists. And then they were cut. The mythology is consistent on this point. The trees did not simply die. They were removed. The cedar forest of the Mesopotamians was logged by Gilgamesh. The Norse Yggdrasil is gnawed and consumed. The Hindu Ashvatha is instructed to be cut. The Maya world tree fell at the end of the previous age through an event the Popol Vuh describes as catastrophe, not natural aging. The Siberian traditions speak of the tree being taken, not dying. Something removed these organisms. The question of what did the removing is where the Tartaria research community diverges into multiple competing theories, and an honest accounting of the evidence has to acknowledge that divergence. Some researchers believe the megaflora was harvested by the civilization that preceded us for its biomass, for its mineral content, for resources we no longer recognize as resources because we have never encountered organisms of this scale. Some believe the removal was the mechanism of the reset itself, that whoever orchestrated the erasure of the previous civilization targeted the biological infrastructure first, knowing that without the megaflora, the atmosphere would destabilize, and the population that depended on that atmosphere would be catastrophically reduced. Some believe the removal was catastrophic rather than deliberate, a consequence of the same geological event that produced the mud flood evidence and the buried cities. What all versions agree on is the result. The trees are gone, the atmosphere changed, the sky changed color. The civilization that coexisted with the megaflora was erased or collapsed. And the new institutional framework that was built over the wreckage redefined the stumps as geological features, the memories as mythology, and the atmospheric data in the paintings as artistic style. But the memories are still there, in every culture, in every tradition, on every continent. The same tree, the same scale, the same function, the same fate. And when you see this clearly, you cannot unsee it. Every indigenous cosmology you encounter from this point forward will show you its axis. Every sacred mountain that indigenous people describe as living, as breathing, as spiritually present in a way that ordinary rock is not, will look different to you. Every columnar rock formation you encounter in a national park or on a geological survey will show you its cellular geometry. Every old painting you look at will show you its sky. And then you begin to understand that the world you were handed is not the world that was here before. That the definitions you were given, what a tree is, what a geological formation is, what mythology is, and what history is, were installed at a specific moment by specific institutions for a specific purpose. And really, that is the most unsettling part of all. The purpose was to prevent you from recognizing what you are walking through every day. You are walking through the ruins of a world that was larger than anything in your textbooks, a world that had organisms so vast that the human imagination preserved them as gods and axes of the universe, because no other category was adequate. A world that had an atmospheric chemistry so different from the current one that the painters who recorded it faithfully are accused of artistic stylization because the reality they depicted is too far outside the current framework to be accepted. The tree that touched the sky was real. Every culture on Earth is telling you it was real. The stumps are still there. You drive past them on highways and visit them in national parks and photograph them on tourist itineraries and go home and never question why the official explanation for their geometry requires you to ignore what your eyes are showing. You ask the question, look at the stumps. Read the myths as history rather than symbol. Look at the sky in the old paintings. Trace the timeline of the institutions that redefined all of it, and note exactly when those institutions were founded and exactly what they needed to be true in order to function. The answer is there. It has always been there in every culture on Earth, in every language, in every tradition that survived the reset. They are all saying the same thing. There was a tree. It touched the sky. It was real, and then it was gone. If this line of thought is pulling at something deep in your mind, something your education told you to ignore, then leave your view in the comments. If you found the argument compelling, give it a like and subscribe in your own way for the next part of the journey.